I'm Beth Pariseau, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. Joshua Corman is Executive in Residence for Public Safety and Resilience at the Institute for Security and Technology, or IST, a nonprofit think tank based in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is also a co-leader of a Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, community working group for SBOM on-ramps and adoption. Previously, he was Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy for Claroty, an IoT security company, Chief Strategist on the CISA COVID Task Force, Director of the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, and CTO at security software vendor Sonatype. In August, Corman delivered a presentation at CISA's SBOM event, warning that time is running out to more effectively protect critical infrastructure systems, such as the water and power supply, that rely on potentially vulnerable software to operate. Corman emphasized the urgent need to more effectively identify vulnerabilities and defend against attacks such as China's Typhoon nation-state threat group. An initiative Corman is heading at IST under the working title Undisruptable 27 now looks to address these threats. Thanks for being with us, Josh.
Really good to see you.
Likewise. So, the 27 in Undisruptable 27 refers to the year 2027 as the deadline for more effectively protecting critical infrastructure, correct?
Yeah, which is thought-provoking and controversial, but important.
Yeah, why that year?
So some people know me from, I founded a group called IamTheCavalry.org 11 years ago on August 1st at Hacker Summer Camp. And we were focused on wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So the idea that this isn't just your privacy, your confidentiality of records, breaches and fines, this is also public safety, human life, is not new from me. But I think what changed for me and for others is that in late January this year, the four horsemen of the cyber leadership for the federal government came out in an unclassified hearing and revealed to the public the Typhoon campaign out of the CCP in China. And this particular campaign, they found and evicted persistent access in the nation's water and wastewater facilities and other critical infrastructure. They described this as pre-positioning to have a foothold to potentially, quote, rain chaos on the homeland and citizens if the U.S. were to interfere with China's intentions towards Taiwan as early as 2027, hence the 27. There is wild debate on if this will happen ever, if it'll happen later. I think the key, though, is the general public is unaware that we have such exposure to accidents and adversaries currently, and I don't think it's comforting that we persist at the will of our adversaries. And whether it's China or someone else, we live in glass houses. People are about to start throwing rocks. If there is a war, it will be a hybrid conflict. And many of our adversaries have demonstrated they are both willing and able to disrupt this homeland critical infrastructure.
Right. Before we dig into Typhoon a little bit, just to level set, how do you define critical infrastructure? And what does it have to do with software security?
Right. So luckily, I don't have to define it, but I can sub-define it.
Sure.
Under President Obama, PPD 21, or Presidential Policy Directive 21, 16 designated critical infrastructures were mapped out and defined. Quite recently, its successor document is called NSM 22, I believe. It's still the same 16 sectors. So there are 16 designated critical infrastructure sectors. They have names. Each one has a custodian in the federal government. Each one has a public-private partnership. The public is the custodian or the Government Coordinating Council, and the private is a sector coordinating council or an SCC. Some of them are stronger partnerships than others. Some of them are non-existent. But you could name and enumerate these. You could check CISA now that CISA exists, 5 years old and counting. CISA was born in part to be a shared muscle and resource across those 16 sectors of critical infrastructure and has responsibilities in federal law to identify and buy down risk in those alongside the sector risk management agencies. So to make this concrete, it could be something like financial services, which the Treasury would be the public-private partnership, and the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council would be the private half. Prior to CISA, each one of them would try their best and do their best, and there wasn't a lot of attack density in cyberspace. But as that changed, CISA was born to be a shared resource and muscle to hire, train, recruit, retain, and leverage cybersecurity talent across those. So there are 16 of them, which is actually one of the concerns I have, so I'll add some definition, is that when everything's critical, nothing's critical. So the IT sector is critical infrastructure. Great. So does that mean that Angry Birds, the software on my phone is as important as time-sensitive, life-sensitive delivery of patient care in a hospital? Absolutely not.
Right.
So I actually find CISA has a term called National Critical Functions, or NCFs. There's 55 of those, and these are more service oriented. So instead of saying what's the risk to HPH, healthcare and public health includes large hospitals and small hospitals, large device manufacturers and small ones, mortuaries and crematoriums, yoga clinics, and even pharmaceutical. So it's a really vast and diverse sector, and most of the well-funded government affairs and lobbyists swarm the leadership of the private sector voice at the cost and neglect often of the target-rich cyber poor, which is 85% of the rest of us. I look at those and I say it's much easier to manage risk at a critical function level. And these are things like provide drinking water, or provide medical care, or maintain access to medical records. So they're very specific, and you can tell if there's been a disruption, to what extent, for how long did it take to recover. And out of those 55, back to my idea that when everything's critical, nothing is, this project aims to remind people there are life safety, lifeline, national critical functions that command our attention before we protect Angry Birds or ATM machines.
Mm-hmm. So what are those most critical functions that you're focused on?
So out of the 55 in a keynote I gave at S4 last spring, I pointed out there's about a dozen time-sensitive, life-sensitive of those national critical functions that, if disrupted, could lead to loss of life or a crisis of confidence in the public within 24 to 48 hours. They happen to be cross-sector in nature, so no water means no hospital. So it's not just that they're important on their own, it's that one can cause disruptions to the other. So I looked at about a dozen of those national critical functions. People could argue over life sensitivity, magnitude impact, or time sensitivity, but there are some loose definitions in the federal documents. And with NSM 22 and what's coming of the replacement national plan, they're calling it, we look to find even more specific definitions for lifeline. But for my purposes, for this project, the working title of Undisruptible 27, I'm deeply concerned that we are highly disruptible in the water and wastewater, in power, for our local communities, in emergency medicine, timely access to patient care when and where your family needs it, and to a more strategic extent to the nation's food supply. Of those two, the pilot that Craig Newmark generously funded is looking at the nexus of water disruption and emergency medicine disruption.
And so where does software come into all this?
Mark Andreessen famously said software is eating the world, and I retorted at the time, software is infecting the world. We're putting software into everything. And a long time ago, even before the cavalry, I wrote something called the Rugged Software Manifesto in response to the Agile Manifesto. And one of my co-authors, David Rice, had written a book called Geekonomics, The True Cost of Insecure Software, where he really explored this in force across multiple disciplines. And our general talking track was that society depends on steel and concrete, and we depend on them because they're dependable, they're transparent, they're visible. No one sits in perpetual fear that the building they're in is going to collapse upon them. Nobody thinks the bridge they're driving over is going to collapse. Knock on wood, right? But we're becoming as dependent on software, which is not nearly as dependable or reliable. In fact, it's infinitely exploitable. And 100 of the Fortune 100 have lost intellectual property and trade secrets. We just don't yet know how to incentivize or defend and make dependable, defensible, resilient software infrastructure. So as we add software and connectivity to everything, we expose ourselves to accidents and adversaries. So an evolution of rugged was rugged DevOps, because the DevOps community really liked this and wove it into a lot of their thinking for resilience and site reliability engineering. And then they look at things like DIE, or distributed immutable ephemeral. They want more maintainable, less complex, more obvious, more instrumented, more transparent, hence SBOM, things like that. So there was a push in the pioneers of the software development industry to say, yeah, we have an awesome responsibility that comes with designing and deploying and maintaining digital infrastructure. Let's do a better job. And now we're kind of in a foot race of, can we make that digital infrastructure more dependable and defensible before people start throwing rocks? And unfortunately, whether it's conflict coming with China, whether it's active conflict in the Middle East, whether it's our participation in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, our adversaries both can and have compromised this critical infrastructure. The question is how aggressive they use this as an arrow in their quiver for hybrid conflict.
So how did we get to this point, and how do we get out of it? What do we need to do to protect software systems that run critical infrastructure?
Yeah, this isn't going to be easy or a magic bullet or even silver buckshot. It took 30 plus years to dig this hole, and we're not going to get out of it in the next 2 years. For one, we have market failures, and we kind of acknowledge this with different presidents and different executive strategies and different executive orders. The private sector likes to not be regulated. I mean, we had our first death from software failure over 35 years ago with a Therac 25 machine. It's a radiation delivery machine that had an off by 1 or 2 decimal point. So you got 10 times or 100 times the radiation intended through design flaw. And at the time, we chose that IT was the fastest growing part of the economy in a global market, and we didn't want to stifle innovation. So we said, let's wait 2 or 3 or 5 years before we regulate. And now we have continued to not. So you often hear software liability come up or some form of liability regime come up. There actually is a little bit of software liability, but that could be a whole episode. But in lieu of that, I've been pushing either rugged DevOps type positive patterns into the pioneers that are making better software cheaper, faster, or trying to drive transparency like SBOM or software bill of materials, or trying to drive successors to this like the CISA program for secure by design, secure by default, secure by demand. But we are trying to defend indefensible things, and it's going to take a while. I think we're on the right track for some of these. They're just not going to manifest the yield that we need in the time horizons for which I'm speaking. So we're going to have to take a multi-level approach. In some cases, if we're over-dependent on undependable things, if we're exposing ourselves to accidents like CrowdStrike or adversaries like ransom crews and nation states or lone wolves, we could have a fork in the road. You can make it more dependable. I think we've started, but I think it's going to take a while. Or you could depend upon it less. So maybe if you're an owner and operator of water and wastewater facility and you don't have enough money or staff for a security team to implement best practices or just do zero trust or just do the NIST cybersecurity framework, maybe it's not shields up, maybe it's connections down. If we are over dependent on undependable things, we could depend less. And if we're not in that position, sometimes the correct action to take in the face of a cyber risk is an analog mitigation. So do we have the ability to weather a multi-day, multi-week disruption to water? And have you asked your hospital, how long can you operate without water? Because I have started asking, and the answer in a lot of cases is they shut down most things within 4 hours. They can go quite a while without power, but they cannot go much without water.
Yikes. So
Yeah.
at the CISA SBOM event, you gave a presentation and you said, time's up. What did you mean by that? What does that mean going forward?
There's a lot it could mean. I was deliberately vague. Some people know more what I mean than others. But as I was preparing those remarks, so I kind of introduced SBOM as a concept into public policy in July of 2013, January 2014 in Congress. And there was a bill later that year in December, a bipartisan bill called the Cyber Supply Chain Management and Transparency Act of 2014. The private sector hated it. They wanted to kill it with fire. They flew people in and screamed at Chairman Royce, the sponsor. It was meant to be a discussion draft from what I understand, and it actually killed the discussion because the idea of being liable was such a non-starter, but even being transparent about the risks you're passing downstream seemed to be a non-starter. And it was politically DOA, but I think everyone involved knew this is going to happen. It has to happen. It's a no-brainer to have happen. And they were mostly trying to stall and delay and buy time. There's a talk I gave at RSA conference a couple years ago called The Opposite of Transparency. There's a lot of excuses people make as to why not to be transparent, but really underpinning all of them are 3. They have license legal debt in that they're using open source licenses against their license terms and conditions and don't want to admit that or reveal that. So they have some sins of the past to hide, some skeletons in their closet on a legal license, technical debt. Number 2, they have cybersecurity debt that's unremediatable or cost prohibitive to remediate. So they might be using an unsupported end-of-life, cryptographically broken library, but they're selling to somebody who requires FIPS or something like that. So they're afraid that this newfound transparency may reveal long-standing sins of the past on the cybersecurity, and it may cost too much to rewrite or refactor those APIs to a modern version of struts or something like that. And then third is the ongoing scrutiny they fear from their customers who, upon seeing that, hey, this new CISA known exploited vulnerability or KEV list just came out today. I see that you use that affected library. When am I getting a patch? At the moment, the obscurity allows a large software manufacturer to take their time and wait and hope no one notices and schedule the time and place of fixing it, if ever. And now they will have an ongoing cost of scrutiny, justified scrutiny, And hence why some of the people that lean into this have adopted VEX as a way to do, if we're going to have machine-generated, machine-readable software bill of materials that could identify potentially exploited vulnerabilities, now you have a formatted way to speak one-to-many after you've triaged them to all of your customers across space and time. So those attestations were the lean-in way, but those three things of license debt, cybersecurity debt, and ongoing scrutiny have scared people, and they've made excuses, and they successfully watered down the executive order 14028, and something that mentions SBOM throughout and is sometimes called the SBOM EO does not actually even allow CISA to say the word SBOM in the self-attestation form. So we were looking for hard artifacts for all software. So the federal government, Biden said that's what he wants, and the industry said no, and systematically watered it down. So I think what I meant by time's up is in parallel with all this hand-wringing and excuse-making. And while some people have shown there are tools to do this, there's tools to do these at scale. This is not that hard. It actually makes your software better. There's two camps. There's those making progress and those making excuses. But partly we're out of time because 2027 is rapidly approaching. And if we have known exploited vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure that allows accidents and adversaries to damage the water in your town for months, or to knock out power in the winter or the summer, or to allow degraded, delayed care for your hospital, or worse, weaken your hospital financially sufficient to drive it out of business, and you have 2-hour drive for emergency care. These outcomes are in part because we've looked the other way on preventable flaws in our digital infrastructure. And when I say time's up, it's that when I said SBOM was coming, transparency was coming in a very Game of Thrones sense, it occurred to me as well that December marks a decade of excuse making. So I'm turning the page, I'm turning the chapter, and several of us are going to be driving much harder at liability, at accountability, and at potentially making examples out of the worst offenders that have endangered public safety, economic, and national security.
Wow. So in the meantime, as of next week, we'll have a new president. And how is that going to influence what happens next with all of this?
Well, for my part, my own personal journey, I have found cybersecurity and defensibility and resilience to be a nonpartisan and bipartisan topic. And at least given how I have approached these missions and which missions we've approached, perhaps that's not universally everyone's experience. But here's an example of bipartisan. The cavalry brought the first delegation of sitting congressmen to DEF CON, at DEF CON 25. We had Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, a Democrat, and Will Hurd of Texas, a Republican. They were both pretty key in the cyber caucus in the House. We had similar bipartisan support in the Senate. A lot of these bills that we've worked on, like the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act or the Patch Act, which was making mandatory minimum cybersecurity hygiene for medical devices, that passed in law recently. It's in effect as of last year. Requires SBOM, by the way. So these things we worked on have been bipartisan. So I hope that we can continue to do that. I think tactically we're at a disadvantage because anytime there's an election for the White House, you see a lot of the political appointees turn over. And a lot of these agencies' personality and priorities are pretty heavily affected by who's in those political leadership roles. And a lot of their staff tend to roll off as well. So you've already seen people resign after good, long federal service, like Eric Goldstein at CISA, people from the White House, like Rob Kanaki and Chris Ingles and Kemba. So as you see more roll off, that state of transition means there's new people coming in, there's a ramp up time, they're figuring out their priorities, who they can and can't work with. So we will have some headwinds, no matter who wins the White House. And Congress also goes through shifts, but on top of both the House and Senate turning over and committee leads, as well as the White House turning over, we also recently had the overturn of Chevron doctrine and Chevron deference. And that too is going to be challenging for defenders and for national interests, because you have all these laws that deliberately were written to be vague and future-proofed. Understand in an era where they knew that the regulator of record with more expertise could issue updated guidance over time. And now that very staying power and deliberate ambiguity becomes a liability, because unless there's explicit overt permission to regulate, you can be more challenged in the courts. So if we know that there may be cyber missiles coming at our very fragile water facilities and power as early as 2027, and we are going to have a brand new slate of committee leadership and White House leadership and executive branch leadership, and anything they have already put into place might be challenged, it's not great timing for a federal fix to this, which I think was one of the reasons we put so much of the push on Undestructible 27 to aim at local municipal leadership, owners and operators in our communities, actual citizens, stakeholders who will be blindsided by these unnatural disasters when they make landfall. And we've excluded them far too long. This is maybe as good a time as any to shift to their love language, meet them where they are, and help them understand what's coming so they can brace for impact and maybe reduce the harm.
And does Volt Typhoon stand out to you as maybe the most credible threat, or the one that there's a definite timeline for, or why does that one stand out?
It's a good question. I think they're the most transparent and overt in their intentions. I've been doing cybersecurity a long time. We weren't even calling it cybersecurity, but if people look back, there was a lot of hand-wringing about nation-state espionage and stealing intellectual property, and it's not really happening, or it's not really a concern. And there's that old Maya Angelou quote, when someone tells you who they are, believe them. And thus far, there's a very high batting average for things stated by this particular country's leadership in public policy in the open and them following through. So I think a lot of us in the national security apparatus and even the cybersecurity realm know that if Xi Jinping says they're going to do something, they're going to do it. The question isn't an if, it's a when. And their hope, I believe, is the U.S. just stays out of their fight. We're unlikely to in that time horizon, if ever. So on an escalatory ladder, a lot of us look at this as whenever they choose, they can do their hybrid strategy. They want us to stay out of it, so this is already a deterrent on the ladder. And if we get involved a little bit, they might do a demonstration of force or a warning shot or a brushback pitch if you're a baseball fan. I'm not. And then theoretically, it could be all-out chaos as described in some of their literature and statements. So I think they're hoping the U.S. stays out, but we're unlikely to. So whether that happens or not, though, I really agonized over putting the number 27 here because my first job in and out of college was working on Y2K, what became a non-event. But we knew a date was coming. We had credible reason to believe it could do significant harm. We knew a lot of the systems might be okay, but some would not be okay. And we had to very quickly prioritize which systems are where the cost of failure is too high to bear. And we put our limited testers and COBOL engineers on the things that cannot fail, and people marshaled the resources against a deadline, and we did something about it. Similarly, and more importantly, more recently, during my leadership of the CISA COVID task force, we had 4,000 suppliers to Operation Warp Speed. We prioritized 66 that I call ball bearings, or small unguarded weak links in the supply chain, that if disrupt any one, we'd have a lot of dead people. And they were target rich and cyber poor. They didn't have best practices. They didn't have zero trust. They didn't have a single security person on staff. So we had to identify and buy down risk where they were. And we had about 3 months. So we did a decent job removing elective low-hanging fruit, getting them off Shodan, getting the KEVs off their known vulnerabilities, exposures, getting them into some regular scanning and constant contact in case something went wrong. So if we can do a lot in 3 months, I asked, what can we do instead of just waiting for the tsunami to hit us in 2027 or 2028? If we treat this as a marshaling moment, as a date on the calendar, if we could do a lot in 3 months, what could we do in maybe 2 years, a year and a half? And maybe we have more time. But as we started launching this, maybe we have less time because we've actually seen the cyber avengers in Iran compromise water facilities in Pennsylvania. We've seen a different crew recently, a non-Sudan, charged with intent to take loss of life with disruptions on U.S. healthcare facilities and got indicted a couple weeks ago. We know Russia is watching our approvals of new types of munitions for the conflict in Ukraine and new advances into territory. And at some point we cross a line that we get a brushback pitch. So I think we could see disruption of U.S. critical infrastructure earlier than 2027, but we had to create a sense of urgency, curiosity, and preparedness that when hurricanes come in, you can't stop it from making landfall. But what FEMA does and national leadership do, they do the 3 I's of inform, influence, inspire. They don't infantilize you. They say, this is what we know. This is what we don't know. We're going to be straight with you. And then this is what the best thing you can do is. If you can't do that, this is the next best thing. And then they try to stay in constant communication so that we'll be okay on the other side of this if we trust each other. And I think we're going to have a season of concurrent hurricanes, maybe across all these different communities, and many of which are not ready for this. So if they're a community that can disconnect, maybe they should. If they're one that can at least do the basics, like get their stuff off Shodan or get on the pay attention to the KEV list, great. But no matter what, we should probably be doing crisis simulations. Ask the hospital, how long can you go without water? Or what can we do to prioritize water to the hospital? Or ask the community to have a few days or weeks of water on hand or life straws so they are less dependent on the recovery from the town. But we are very short on time, have a lot to do, and we have to raise the alarm without being alarmist and inform them without paralyzing them with fear.
Well, great to talk to you, Josh, although somewhat unnerving. And I do hope that your efforts succeed, of course.
Well, we could use help. If anybody wants to participate or at least protect their household and their community, you can sign up for our Slack. This is a volunteer army. It's undisruptible27.org will take you there to get some more information. Like I said, Craig Newmark has funded the pilot. We have a lot of interest in this thing that affects everybody. And the more people that get involved, the smarter we get and the more help we have. And it's a nice lens to look through, whether we're not just looking at breaches and futility and ransoms all the time. We're looking at resilience and life safety in our own communities.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 2, The State of SecOps. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions, comments, or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R-I, S as in Samuel, E-A-U at techtarget.com. Please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about the challenges facing security operations. Thank you for being with us so far.